My name is Jennifer Bettles, and my presentation is on the effects of gender on reading achievement. In looking at this topic, I found 3 articles that were relevant. I retrieved all of my articles from the ERIC, or Education Resources Information Center database, located at eric.ed.gov. My first article was entitled Differential Effects of Male and Female Reading Tutors Based on Boys' Gender Views of Reading from the Canadian Journal of Education. I then found an article titled Reliability and Stability of Elementary Reading Attitude Survey, ERAS Scores Across Gender, Race, and Grade Level from the Professional Educator. And then I found one titled Talking Books, Gender and the Responses of Adolescents in Literature Circles from the English Teaching Practice and Critique Journal. First one I'm going to look at is the differential effects of male and female reading tutors. In this article, the researchers were testing the idea that boys who struggle as readers will respond more positively and with greater gains if they're given male reading tutors than female reading tutors. They randomly selected boys from grades 3 and 4, and then the boys who were selected identified their own views of reading using the tool Gendered Activities Q-Sort, in which they were given pictures of activities, and then they identified whether those activities were feminine, masculine, or gender neutral. In the study, by the end of the study, there were 173 boys who participated from beginning to end. It was conducted over 2 years. Each year there was a 22-week cycle of tutoring that went on. Of the boys in the study, they were randomly paired with either a male or a female, and they worked once a week with that tutor for the 2-year study. Boys who were paired with a male at the beginning remained with a male. Boys with a female remained with a female. And they did try and do it directly in half, although there was an odd number of boys, half with a male and half with a female. They were assessed using the Alberta Diagnostic Reading Program, or ADRP, on their reading ability, and then their attitude about themselves as readers was determined by the Reader's Self-Perception Scale, or the RSPS. After the study, they found that boys in both of the groups made significant gains in reading achievement and self-perception of themselves as readers. If they started the study with reading as viewed as feminine, they ended up making greater gains in their self-perception as readers when they worked with a female tutor than if they worked with a male tutor. Although the vast majority of boys, 91.2%, did not view reading as a feminine activity. They identified it as either masculine or gender neutral. In those cases, the gender of the tutor had no effect on their self-perception as readers, and an insignificant effect on their reading achievement by the end of the study. So what does that mean for us? What the researcher in this study identified was that if there are other researchers out there who are looking for long-term changes in boys' reading achievements, if they want to look at this idea a little closer, they would need a longer-term study to see if maybe over time there was a more significant role. It was also identified that gender is not the only factor in reading achievement, and that there's so many other factors that need to be examined, and they need to be looking at other reading strategies beyond just pairing boys with a male reading tutor. It invalidates the movement that's currently going on in some places, that more male staff members need to be hired to target boys' reading instruction. And Katz, who was the primary researcher, stated that both males and females can be effective reading tutors for all boys. And Katz also hypothesized that female reading tutors experience more success with all students because they've been shown in other research studies to be more positive in their attitudes, offer more praise and encouragement. He cited this information, although he did not actually test it in the study he conducted. The second article I'm going to talk about was the one titled Talking Books, Gender and the Responses of Adolescents in Literature Circles. And I linked this to the first study because they were identifying there needs to be other strategies that we use to target boys, and this study did just that. She was targeting literature circles. And the researcher in this study, her name was Lloyd, She identified that girls have been able to narrow the achievement gaps in math and science, but boys are still lagging behind girls in literacy. And so she also had the idea that boys see reading as a more feminized activity. She also hypothesized that the texts we choose to use in the classroom are rarely the first choice that boys would have, and that boys practice literacy in more diverse ways than we usually use in the classroom. Literature circles were chosen because they may be a tool to promote gender equity and literacy. And she also stressed at the very beginning of her study that gender is not a monolithic aspect of identity. I think that's a great quote because gender intersects with other factors in reading practices, which also correlates with the first study. Literature circles were chosen because they're student-led, and an element of control is given back to the students, and this may be an important factor for boys. It also helps students construct their own meaning rather than having the teacher construct it for them. And so this study was conducted in a large Midwestern American suburban high school, and it was actually in Minnesota. The participants were all 12th graders in an English course which was taught by the researcher. Literature circles for this study were called book club by the teacher, and it was described as an independent reading assignment that would be done in small groups. What happened was very interesting. In this article, I could probably talk 15 minutes about just this article. In one of the groups, the boys, and she actually had transcripts from their discussions. They would trade insults and put downs, they would joke with one another, make sexual references, and it all seemed to be an attempt to gain power within the group. There were several diverse students. Mai was one, an Asian American girl. She took a very subservient role in the group, and she was always trying to keep the group on task, and she ended up doing the bulk of the work. She had great discussion points, but she was not taken seriously by the boys in the group. Then there was Phuong, a Vietnamese boy. He had been adopted by a white family in the Minnesota town, and he was often ridiculed by the other boys for his heritage and for his native language. However, it's pretty amazing. By the end of the study, they both gave positive reactions and commentary about the experience they had. In the book club groups, they did discuss gender roles and gender in general in the books that they read. The male members had difficulty offering critical examination of the characters in the stories that they were resistant to reading. So they really didn't get into the discussion if it was a book that was not their first choice. If it was their first choice, they engaged in a deeper discussion. Usually, if gender roles came up, it was brought up by the female members of the group. They were the ones driving that discussion. The boys, if there was a character in the book that they saw themselves in the character, they were very resistant to being critical of that character. So Lloyd came to many conclusions after this study. First of all, was that they had to be able to link the story to their own experience in order to have substantive engagement in the discussion. Their first choices were usually based on their connection to the main character, on what little knowledge they had before reading the book. And so boys were usually wanting a male central character and were resistant to the female, while vice versa. Females were less apt to choose a book that had a male central character. And so when she did give the students assigned roles such as discussion director, which is a common practice when doing literature circles, it actually seemed to inhibit the flow of discussion and created a hierarchy within the group, an imbalance of power, and the boys ended up oftentimes trying to usurp that power. Isolations of students based on their gender or race were prevalent among the groups, and it negatively affected the experience for several based on the transcript, but not based on their reactions at the end of the study. Despite all these drawbacks, Lloyd really felt that many of the male students had more critical literacy discussions than in teacher-led situations she had had in the past. And the students overwhelmingly at the end of the study said they preferred this method of study than to the teacher-led discussions. Finally, the last article was the reliability and stability of ERAS scores. And I thought this was an interesting one because it talks about when we do evaluate how students see themselves as readers and how they evaluate their enjoyment of reading, how reliable and stable are those reactions. And so we looked at the elementary reading attitude survey test data. There were 718 students who were used for the sample, and they were in grades 4 through 6, 52% female, 48% male. 49% European American, 51% African American, and their reading abilities ranged from poor to good, very poor to very good. They were given 10 recreational reading items and 10 academic reading items to evaluate. It was based on a 4-point scale, so there was no neutral choice. It either had to be positive or negative. And it's the Garfield test is what I was always taught it was, and I have a picture of Garfield here. They just circled Garfield with a certain facial expression to show how they felt about something. And this was administered on 2 different occasions with a 7-day interval between the two, so it was just 1 week apart from beginning to end. What they found was that in 1 week, the students in grade 4 and 5 had a great deal of change in their scores. And there was one subgroup within the grades 4 and 5 that the stability was as low as 0.48. In other words, over half of them changed their mind about how they felt about reading. This was not as true for 6th graders. They actually had a 0.8 or greater stability in their answers, so it was a little more reliable for them, or a little more stable. And previous research studies show that there was a great deal of change in self-assessment among students over a greater period of time, which was 3 years in that cited study. And so various items can change how a student feels about themselves as a reader on a given day. And so it's of value to assess them more than once and frequently. If a student has recently just gotten a good grade in reading, they probably feel pretty good about reading. If their parents have been hounding them about their homework, they might not feel as good about it. So it can change from day to day and week to week. What does this mean for leadership? Well, I compared the gendered activities Q sort in the first study to the gender leader implicit association test that we gave to ourselves. It's important to think about gender as a leader, but also as a learner. How we see ourselves and how we see what is right for our gender to do will shape how we act. The focus in these studies is often on women, either being in leadership roles or out of leadership roles. And so I thought it was quite interesting to kind of look at males being excluded in the classroom or having gaps in their learning, because that's usually not the focus. Education itself is predominantly female. So how does that translate to the classroom? How do we take a field that is mostly women and help males see that as an appropriate role for them as well? My particular area of interest is that of reading specialists. Study after study that I have looked at indicates that for reading achievement and growth to occur, the students have to identify with the text, whether that's by gender or race or any other avenue. They have to have some type of identity with the text in order to grow from it and to relate to it. To ignore that is to fail the student. We cannot just pick what we want students to read. We need to have their interests and their identities in mind. Diversity goes beyond just gender. It's not just male and female, and even beyond race. Connections to all individuals must be found before critical reading and discussion can occur. We have to look at socioeconomic status. We have to look at where they live. We have to look at all these things. A big piece of this whole puzzle is recognizing that diversity does exist and discussing it rather than skirting around the topic. How does that shape us as people, as learners, as teachers, and leaders? And so overall, I've learned a lot from the articles that I read. I had enjoyment with this project, and I hope you learned something from my presentation. Thank you.